still here. Is everyone awake? I had a Red Bull, so I'm awake, and I kind of have to pee, which means I won't keep you too long, I promise. I'll try not to. It's awesome to be here. So just a quick disclaimer, this is not necessarily a talk just about design tools, even though I love them, and I love using them, and I love talking about them, and they're really fun. This quote kind of resonated with me when I was thinking about what I wanted to say today, and how I think we spend a lot of time talking about some of the cooler aspects maybe of these tools, but don't actually talk about what it actually takes to sometimes ship something. And sometimes there's a lot more than the pixels that go into that. And so it's easy to get distracted by things like animation and visual design. I love it. I love stuff like this. It's fun to make. It's fun to see. It's fun to talk about. And don't get me wrong, I've done a lot of it. I think it's really, really, really exciting. But there's a lot more than that than just the front cover of a book. And a quote that kind of resonates with me quite a bit that I heard a lot when I was working at Google was that generally technology problems are on the easier side. It's actually people problems that are harder. Getting things done in a large organization or a small one. Deciding what to build, doing it in that way, how you communicate to do that. That's the stuff that I think could use more conversation and what I hope to kind of talk a little bit about today. And so I think generally communication and collaboration, a big part of what I'll talk about with Figma, is the most important tool I think we have. So again, not so much just about tools or like animation, stuff like that. This is going to be a bit more about design process and about the design environment and creating a healthy one. And maybe a bit about how tools can support them in the process. So there are kind of like 5 main components to this, like this thesis for what might make a healthy design environment, and we'll go over it in a little bit. But why do I care about this, and who am I to begin with? So I grew up in Pittsburgh. That's me cheating in skee ball. Have you ever played skee ball? You can definitely crawl inside. I don't know why I did that. This is where I'm from, beautiful city. I loved a lot of collaborative things growing up. I loved singing in choir. I loved doing rowing, being in music and bands, and I've always loved collaboration. And I thought I wanted to go into theater, but it turns out it's really hard to do that and hard to sort of sustain yourself doing that. And I also was really into this DeviantArt thing. How many of you have played with DeviantArt back in the day? Like half of you, maybe? Cool, like a bunch of you. Yeah, I don't know what this was, but it was fun. It was just kind of this mashup of Photoshop and 3D rendering services. And I was also making websites and not really sure, you know, I just enjoyed the process of building something for people. That was like my brother's band or a nail salon, where I ended up getting free pedicures for life from that, which was cool, if I go back to Pittsburgh. And then these things, which are kind of interesting. And does anyone ever remember like these tech brushes? I don't know. You could kind of share a Photoshop brush and people could download it, which kind of foreshadows a bit of what I think modern day components are like. And it was really fun. I don't know. And I didn't know if I could really make a career out of it, but I really liked collaborating with people who I didn't even know on the internet, who had made these different kind of interesting images, and you could send them back and forth. I don't know if you've ever played Photoshop tennis or something like it, where you just basically get to kind of collaborate on something together over the internet. It was a lot of fun. So for something like this, for example, you'd get a render that maybe looked like this from someone who was way more talented than me and who knows how to do this kind of stuff. And you could just kind of play with it a bit. You could turn it to its side and maybe flip it around, and then add this kind of like crop it in a way that you like, and then use Photoshop or something like it to kind of stylize it or make it interesting, which I thought was really fun, this idea of mixing and matching stuff. So I ended up finding myself at Carnegie Mellon, a school that kind of had a little bit of a lot of different things, and studied this kind of tongue twister of a major called human-computer interaction. And the interesting thing about the major is that you had to have another major as well. You had to study something else, and you were generally put into teams with people who studied some of these different things, which was really nice because you ended up learning quite a bit from different disciplines, and those diverse teams, I think, made better products. And through that, I found myself at NASA, which is very on theme for today's Space Day, which was really cool. I got to work on the equivalent of kind of like this Apple Watch for astronauts, or this thing where, you know, ideally or in the future, it was kind of a theoretical project in a way. You could see us kind of dressing up in spacesuits and kind of like prototyping it in a way. You know, you couldn't really touch the screens because you had big gloves. So you had to make these little kind of Arduino buttons, and it was a lot of fun. Only, I think, ultimately, at the end of the day, the work kind of found itself probably into a library somewhere and not really something into the world necessarily. So it was really fun and really cool, but not necessarily as fulfilling. So I found myself at Google, where I spent a big portion of my career, about 5 years, working on search, and was really into prototyping, and eventually moved to Amsterdam for a bit and worked with Framer, and then moved to New York, where I spent some time at ClassPass, which is a monthly fitness membership. I got to work with this wonderful and talented team and really learn a lot about management in that process. And while I was there, we had started using this tool. We had started using Figma. And for those of you who don't, how many of you have heard of Figma, maybe? OK, whoa, cool. And how many of you have used it before? Okay, nice, like half, like just this half. We'll talk after. So basically the gist is it's kind of like, Google Docs meets Photoshop. So multiple people can be in the same file. It's web-based, so it's collaborative and fast, and you can jump in and make stuff together. And it was cool, because at ClassPass, at the time, we were using it quite a bit to just kind of like have an easier way of jumping into a file and working on it, which is a lot of fun. But it also let us do other interesting kinds of use cases, like this one, where we had to render all these different maps from all these different cities of where these different studios were. And to do it would have taken one designer quite a bit of time, right? You kind of need to map out what all the cities are going to be. And you're going to have to, we could have done it programmatically maybe, but it was pretty tricky to get it to the right sizings that we wanted to. So instead, we just jumped into Figma together, which was kind of fun. Basically split it up by region, and then kind of just like, it happened a lot faster, maybe in a couple minutes or something instead of an hour. And it was just fun. And so I had loved my experience working on it, and had gotten called by Dylan, who'd founded the company, and turned out there was timing to move back to San Francisco, where I feel very lucky to get to work with these very talented designers and work on this like kind of future of collaborative tools. And a lot of what my job is kind of some combination of these things, and maybe more specifically, or an easier way to look at that as a design manager, are these 5 things. So, recruiting and attracting talent, setting context and sharing that, providing feedback, and creating a conducive environment for design, and helping other teams do the same. And that's kind of the focus of this talk. That last 2 is where I'll spend most of this kind of conversation. And so one of the things that's interesting, and probably one of my favorite parts of the job, is that you get to meet with lots of different design teams of all different shapes and sizes and understand how they work, because ultimately we want to build tools for them. And so spending time doing that, I learned a lot about different kinds of ways of working, or different collaboration styles, and it was really fun. And so with that comes these kind of philosophies, or whatever you want to call them, for creating a fun, collaborative design environment. So the first one is the idea that design is for everyone, not just designers. So when I had graduated college, I was a little arrogant, kid, kind of like felt like, oh, I knew all these things about design. I'm going to go and get into a room and design a bunch of cool stuff with a bunch of people, and then kind of pitch it to the team and say, like, here's this great idea, or something like that. And I couldn't have been more wrong. Enter this person, Dan, and his cool skateboard. This was our engineering lead, and I remember soon after starting working at Google, we were working on the iOS apps. He would come into this design area that we had, and he kept like kind of proposing all these different ideas. And I remember just at the time not really understanding how to work in teams yet necessarily, and being like, oh, well, like, you just come back when it's done. Like, we're still working on it, right? But he would keep showing up, and you'd be like, well, that's kind of neat, but check out this thing that I built. And every time I was like, oh my God, that's really good. That's amazing. And I kind of had to learn to like lose this ego as a designer and realize that like everyone has good ideas, and everyone has different ways of sort of expressing and communicating them. And so over time, I very quickly learned that maybe there's a different way of working, where it doesn't have to be this idea of working in this design studio where you have this kind of like bubble where you kind of feel creative and innovative together, and then maybe you go out and do this big reveal. There's a lot of risk there, that you missed a lot of things along the way, or that you didn't really get anyone motivated about the ideas of working together, and you might have missed opportunities to have better concepts. And this was actually a space, within Google there's lots of different ways of working, and in some cases they work in a studio like this, in some cases they're more integrated. So in this case, maybe you had the engineering team outside. And so it looked a little something like this. You'd have designers, maybe you'd have a bunch of engineers, and then they would hire a PM who had to kind of like do this little dance and run back and forth to kind of communicate the concepts between the teams, which was a little bit flawed in my opinion in a lot of different ways. And it kind of spread the myth that design is this kind of black box thing with all these different ideas that are kind of not really opaque to anyone else but people who are working on it, which I don't believe is really the best way to work. So what if instead we enabled a process where people actually worked in the same environment together, no matter what your title was or something like that? Because at the end of the day, there's a lot of different roles or different people that play a part in the design process, whether you're a marketer and you're writing sort of copy or something like that, or you're kind of coming up with a brand strategy, or you're the engineer kind of who needs to kind of come in and whether it's come up with the concept or slice the assets. I very much prescribe to sort of this philosophy that really anyone who influences the product that you're building is essentially a designer and impacts the end experience. And so the idea here is that design is collaborative and good ideas can come from anywhere, but there's a lot of friction, unfortunately, in making this happen in reality. So imagine you started at a new job, right? It's your first day. You're really excited. You've been wanting to work there for a while. You've got all these cool ideas. You got this kind of like document. It's got maybe like a bunch of helpful links for you. You're kind of still meeting everyone. Maybe you open up Slack and you're inundated with messages and all this information. And really you have some ideas and you want to get running, but you're not really sure how to start. Or maybe you hack on a screenshot or something like that. Maybe finally you find a file that seems close enough to something that you want to work on in some way. You maybe download the right software you need, you get some prototype going, and then you're kind of stuck back in the loop of figuring out where to put it. Everyone's got kind of different labels or different ways of kind of placing their work. And maybe in some cases, if you're not a designer, you don't have the software actually installed, which is a lot of friction, I think, just to express an idea or just to share some language in some way. And so in practice, like, how do people actually get to weigh in if they have to go through all this friction? How do people actually share and collaborate and share ideas? And I think on top of that, like, the fidelity of the idea seems to matter a lot. Unfortunately, I think sometimes. Someone might have a great idea, but not be able to communicate it in the same fidelity as another idea. So in this case, if you're doing something and it's kind of wireframey or sketchy, unfortunately, people don't often spend as much time investing in listening and hearing out that concept. And so how do we make a more level playing field? And so the idea with something like Figma is that generally people can jump into the same place and use the same language and use the same product without all that friction. So now you can kind of just see everything in one place. You know where all the work is. You don't have to dig around in files, and you can jump in and make the changes you need. And it's not a new idea. In general, the fact that everyone is a designer has been talked about for a long time. In fact, participatory design, for those of you who've heard of it, or the idea of involving not only just your core team, but your customers directly in the process of creating what's needed, has been happening for many years. And in modern kind of like frameworks or tools people use, it's the same sort of thing. In the first few days of a new project, you do a lot of research. You involve lots of people. And if you wanted to, you could certainly do this digitally, which is a lot of fun. Oh, go back and let that play maybe for a second. And maybe it won't. We found that a lot of times that a kind of extra step of like taking a photo of something and then having to sort of like upload it and sort of trace it later is a lot of work. Why not just kind of make it together? And the thesis in this first part is that generally, if people are more engaged in your idea as you're working on it, people might be more passionate about the end result or be more passionate about actually making it as good as you want it to be. And so here's some examples of designs that I did not do at all, but worked on the team of an engineer or a product manager who did these ideas, and I thought they were really cool. And so in this one, an engineer was like, oh, I don't really love that when you scroll to the bottom, you could only see one title, and so kind of just created this prototype where they were stacked instead. Or in this case, for the Google app, maybe depending on how much time it's been since you opened it, you get a different behavior, because on your phone, you're on the go, your tasks can change. If it's an hour later, the same thing you were looking at before might not be relevant anymore. You might be onto a new task. So what if you just changed the nature of what you saw when the app opened, which I would have never thought of, but someone on the team just kind of had this idea, and I thought it was really cool to kind of empower that and help that person's idea kind of come out by making a prototype or something like that. And at Figma, we have an amazing engineer named Susan who helped come up with this idea for styles where the interaction model of kind of sliding it out. We were kind of stuck on this problem of making it accessible in different pages, and it was great. And so I think in general, this lesson of kind of like we don't have to always be the ones with the ideas to create great work and to let it out. This was another example at Google. We built this kind of idea, like this way for anyone in the company to come up with a Google Now card. And so people could jump in and then make changes directly and then submit them, which is a really fun way for anyone without any design experience at all to send an idea and share it and get it out there. And it was just like a hack day project. And it ended up getting tons and tons of ideas, some of which got actually built, just by making the process more collaborative and more inviting, which was really neat. So if we can agree that it's helpful to get more people involved in the design process, how about kind of doing it more in the open? And what I mean by that is instead of kind of waiting till the end to share your work, what does it look like to actually be open throughout the entire process, which happens naturally in some of these activities, but could happen a little bit more, so that it's not a black box or inside of a design studio. So one example, what we do is we kind of show like faces of people who are working particularly in a project, which can actually be really helpful. We heard a story from someone who was working at Slack, and they were inside of a file. And while they were there, they saw an engineer come in, and they realized, oh my God, wait, this isn't done. Like, this is not actually the right file yet. And they would have never known if you hadn't had this chance of kind of like having this presence or knowing what people are doing at any given time. And so it was super helpful. They probably saved a lot of time in not building the wrong thing by just being aware of what's happening, and so working in the open. And another kind of idea of being in the open is also just kind of being hackable in general, or a tool that is open in a way that doesn't just stay within the confines of the app, but lets people sort of like do things outside of it, or look at the content inside and do whatever they want. So companies like Uber have been using it for kind of like, for projecting work on the walls, which is really fun, or in GitHub's case, kind of publishing icon sets. And I think it starts to feel a little bit different when you try it. And I think it's cool to see like all these different use cases that come out. In this case, someone kind of realizing that maybe like their breakpoints were off, and they might not have otherwise jumped in the process to give that feedback, but in this way they can do it easily. But it's not for everyone. After it launched, this was one of the first things people said, is like, oh, great, now I can invite people to make changes in files in real time. Wonderful, I'm going to deal with all of this extra cruft. And you can understand sort of like the fear that might come with that initially from people. But I think inevitably, a lot of times, these things are going to happen in the design process anyway, whether or not they happen in the context of the tool or outside of the tool. And so this was kind of the inspiration behind wanting to talk about any of this stuff, which was when someone said that they felt it actually like kind of helped remove the fear of sharing and working in the open. I know that it can be hard at first to kind of show work before it's done, but maybe there are some strategies in some ways that might not be as tricky. And so one way to think about that is to think about what are the other variety of spaces in which people work outside of just in real time or in the open. And I was talking with a designer on our team named Nico, and he showed me this cool thing called the Udo Mia Machine. Have any of you ever heard of this? I had not heard of this at all. Cool. It sounds like none of you have, which is great. So hopefully this is interesting or new to you. The idea of this is it's actually a concept in architecture. There's an architect named David Duane who came up with this idea of maybe a way to design spaces that are used for different things, right? And maybe even intentionally from beginning to end. And so I wanted to take a look at what happens if you apply that to digital spaces. And so, for example, in a gallery, right, you walk in somewhere, you're walking in somewhere new. You don't just walk into someone's sort of like office right away. Hopefully you have something kind of like free and open and inviting and something interesting that has kind of like something to be inspired by and something to talk about. Something to kind of just get you a little bit excited about the work or working with other people. And so just some questions to think about when designing for the gallery experiences in your workplace. How might you get people exploring more freely? How do you encourage kind of openness and discussion? Does your physical space actually encourage this in any way? Do you leave work up on the walls for people to talk to? We've been using Figma internally for like all kinds of things. Like this was a brand mood board that we made. So kind of like you would use it with Pinterest, where you just kind of have everything up, which to me represents sort of this gallery space. I even used it for my most recent tattoo, which is really cool, just to like kind of get inspired by like what kinds of things that I wanted. And I worked with the artist to show the work of hers that I liked the most to create what I ended up getting. And even things like just kind of documentation that can kind of get people started and poking around lots of different work is helpful. So the next space, you kind of shift inward into the salon, which is the idea of where conversation happens, right? In a gallery or in a museum, you might not actually be talking. You might actually just be observing. In this next space, maybe it's like something kind of like this, like a coffee shop or something like that, where people can kind of engage and have a conversation. So the parallel in maybe digital spaces as well is like where, how does this happen naturally, or in physical spaces? Is there like a water cooler equivalent? And how can you invite people to do that? And one thing that we started doing, which is kind of fun, is using it to kind of like have alignment of what we're talking about together. So this was like, maybe as a company, how do we feel philosophically about these different things? And it was really a space for conversation, or even for our new office, kind of picking out different furniture in different ways. It was an active space, not something you would do necessarily just once in isolation and come back, but something where in real time, you didn't even have to speak verbally, and you could understand where someone's preferences lie in a topic. Similarly, using it even for career planning or for people or prospective candidates who are excited about certain projects and being able to map them together over the phone about what they're actually interested in. And we see lots of different ways that people kind of lay out this content or write about it in different ways when they're kind of working through a project that aren't just what you'd think of as normal pixels. And inviting that conversation, again, what happens in the salon in that space. Or even prompting people for specific questions when they land on it so that they know when they get there what kind of things they might want to react to or give feedback to. So moving through the Udo Mia Machine into the middle area, this library, the idea of a space where you can research things and really deeply understand something. And it could still be, in this case, in isolation, just on your own. And so this is actually, I visited GitHub's office recently, and they have this kind of crazy library, and you can kind of go and study there, do whatever you'd want. And in this concept, it might be interesting to think about, like, how do people research products or other products? How do they research in general through your product? How do they do it in your current space? How do you find old work? That's always a huge challenge in companies, I think. When we don't spend a lot of time documenting, it's tricky to go and find it later. And I think in our case, we just try to have really thorough documentation where we can, but we always know that it's tricky for people to do it, but making sure that like you can at least have some content. This is like one for a designer who joined actually today. And so that she could have lots of interesting content so that you felt like you had this, if you ever had downtime or something and you weren't sure what to do, you could have some space to read. And just really just browsing throughout the file system in general and looking for what's going on and getting inspiration, doing some research just by typing a term, which you couldn't really do before. If you were kind of searching through a file system, it takes a lot longer, whereas here you could just type a few keywords and find something that you need. And so in general, this idea that this might be kind of like the hard drive. Then you move into the office, which has some light work. This is kind of our office, and it's maybe just like what kind of work actually happens there. If you have a modern open office or something like that, sometimes it's really hard to get deep work done because you hear everything around you, you see everyone, there's really not a lot of focus, and there's plenty of distraction happening. So I think in this area, it's fun to think about, like, well, what kind of work is conducive in that space in the office? What is it designed for in generally? And when do you have sort of conversations that might be a little bit lighter? Maybe you're preparing for a design critique or something like that. Or maybe you're just doing kind of a light review of something, but not really deeply focusing for a few hours. Because that's what happens in the chamber. Which sounds kind of like an ominous name. I don't know why. And this is kind of like, this is not my room. That would be really cool if it was. But this is like some image I found on the internet of like a private space where you could imagine focusing deeply. And this kind of work is so critical and so hard to find time for in a modern office space. It can be very, very, very tricky to make sure that you have this deep, focused time for hours at a time in a world where you're getting texts and notifications of all different ways and all different kinds. And so making sure that whether it's your office that can do this or whether you need to find another space to do it or even doing it in the software itself, again, kind of thinking about both digital and physical spaces here. So the question is kind of where do you go from this? How do you hide distractions? How do you make sure that you have this time, this really critical time to get work done? So for example, like maybe you turn off notifications in many different places, or you turn off, do not disturb, hide all the applications. In Figma's case, maybe it just means that you lock the file. You make it private to just you, and you only share it when you feel comfortable doing that because you don't want to be distracted. We even let you sort of hide multiplayer cursors if that's something that you could see as a distraction. Anything it is that helps you get good work done. Maybe even making a secret project where you keep that work for some time. So again, how do you think about mapping work that happens in these different spaces in this Udo Mia machine? In your company, in your project, whatever it is, I think it's kind of fun to apply that. So this next one is, so like just to kind of review, step one, you kind of drop the ego as a designer and you start acting more collaboratively. Step two, you kind of do it more in the open in general, making it easier for that kind of collaboration to happen more naturally. Step three is you kind of acknowledge a variety of contexts in which to work. It doesn't always have to be in the open. How do you respect different ways of working and make sure that that's still possible? And this next one is, then what about the work itself? How do you kind of like take advantage of collaboration in kind of interesting ways? And one example I wanted to show was, let's say you were just looking for a simple logo. And in this case, I picked like what should be the easiest possible thing, finding a vector version of the Google logo, right? It should be super easy. Okay, so you go to Google naturally to try to find it. Maybe you start like, you jump to image search, you kind of find something. This might be familiar to some of you, and if you've done anything like this, you find a file, but it's not actually transparent, so you go back, you click on another thing. You're here, you're not sure if this is trusted, you're not sure how to find it, you go back. Maybe finally you find this, like, the right version. Even for something that should be pretty easy, it takes a lot of time. And in general, everyone in your company has probably had to do some task like that, and that's a lot of wasted time. If one person did it, it should be faster for other people to do it. And so really, instead, it should just be something where naturally you kind of go and you have this shared library of content, and it's all just right there. If someone did it once, you have it forever, which means in practice you could kind of scroll through it and just like drag things in really fast and save all that time in research because, again, you want to take advantage of the work that other people are already doing. I think really good collaboration happens in that way. We use this for all kinds of stuff, from cursors to devices to iOS kits, icon sets, faces, photography, anything that can be shared. And it's a lot faster than the old way of doing it in these kind of, you would send a brush on the internet, someone could maybe download it and use it if you've ever tried that. And so basically the rule of thumb here, or the idea or the philosophy is that anytime you design something you think others might find helpful, maybe spend a second, in our case, kind of publishing it as a component in a library, or in other cases, just making it documented somewhere for other people. So for example, Peter on our design team has done these incredible different, sorry, let me go back. Let's see if that plays. Like so many different graphics over his time working on different blog graphics and other sorts of things. And there's times where he's got too much on his plate and we have to get something out the door. And he's done this amazing job just kind of making it really easy for people to go around and just grab something and remix it or play with it. And I think one thing that's interesting to me about this is that people often hold on to their ideas and they're really like worried that other people might take them or other people might use them in different ways. But actually, nothing is really that original. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of Everything is a Remix, but this kind of blew my mind. And on the theme of space, I wanted to share like a really brief clip, if this works, about this idea. That Star Wars, something that hopefully you've all seen in some way, might not be exactly completely innovative or original in its own way. See if this works.
Also huge influences were the Flash Gordon serials from the 30s and Japanese director Akira Kurosawa. Star Wars plays much like an updated version of Flash Gordon, right down to the soft wipes and the opening titles design. From Kurosawa, we get masters of spiritual martial arts, a low-ranking bickering duo, more soft wipes, a beneath the floorboards hideaway, and a boastful baddie getting his arm chopped off.
So a lot of concepts were borrowed from lots of different places, and that's fine. That's great. I think some of the best work happens that way. In fact, I'm sure many of you know this about Apple, right? A lot of its products were inspired by things from Braun in different ways. You can see these kind of back-to-back things that were made in the 60s to represent things that we're now doing today. Nothing is necessarily that original, and again, I think that's okay. I think a lot of the things we make in this world are really mixing and matching things that have already existed in new ways. In college, I heard a quote that really stuck with me forever in my design career, which is this kind of paradox that people want these things that are familiar from their past, but they also want something new. And those two things are always in conflict, wanting something that feels familiar, but something that is novel or interesting. And I think a lot of the objects and products that we use every day kind of have this interesting balance of these things. Another word that I learned recently that I thought was really cool was this idea of bisociation, which is really just, again, like this idea that creativity happens when you mash up two maybe seemingly unrelated things, thereby creating something new in its essence. So just like that old example in the beginning, kind of where I showed like mixing and matching these kind of strange 3D graphics into something, or I had a teacher in school once that said, like, go into nature if you're ever stuck. If you are not inspired, look for something different somewhere else. So we did something really interesting with the Visco design team, where we brought them into our offices and took all their kind of brand language and mixed it into a document. We put on some music, and for an hour, we just made art together, which you'll see in just a second here as it zooms forward. So we took all these different pieces of inspiration. We weren't even talking. We were kind of heads down, and we started to make really interesting things. We started just seeing what would happen if we just kind of got creative and blended work in real time. In 1 hour, we had like kind of this beautiful array of, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 posters. I don't know if we ended up doing anything with them, but it was just a really fun change of pace to have this kind of mix and match of stuff. So the last kind of idea is that once you're kind of free and working in the open and you're okay remixing work and all this sort of stuff, how do we do this in a way where we don't feel this kind of fear that you get when you share work, or this idea of being exposed in some way? And I don't know how many of you watch The Daily Show, but I was super interested in how they work and how they kind of like have their design process for creating jokes on a daily basis. And this is a quick quote from a podcast by Adam Grant that talks about some of their work. If this works.
That's called psychological safety. It's where you can take risks without feeling afraid. Without that sense of safety, creative bursts don't happen. People censor themselves.
Well, I've always believed that in any relationship where there is someone who is in charge, whether it's in a family, with a parent, or whether it's a teacher, or whether it's a boss in a work environment, really what brings out the best in people, in my opinion, is a mutual respect. I trust that my writers are trying to help me make the best show, and they trust that I want to make the funniest show. It's taken a long time, but now when I walk into a meeting, I'm walking into a continuing conversation.
So I think it's really cool, this idea of how do you help people feel safe and that they're not going to be judged. And that's a hard thing to do. It doesn't just happen immediately. It takes time to build relationships and trust in a way. And it's a little bit vulnerable sometimes to try something and feel like you might be judged for it. So just some quick strategies that have been helpful, at least for us. Definitely admitting mistakes as often as possible, especially in leadership positions, to set the example that it's encouraged and it's okay. And we all do it all the time. And celebrating those failures when they happen. Or even just sometimes it's just spending quality time outside of work or whatever it is, wherever you can, so that you understand we're all people, we're all human, we're going to make mistakes all the time. We did an offsite recently where we all shared embarrassing work from our past. We started the day with that because it was cool. It was fun. Like, we saw all of this like kind of interesting work. We learned a ton about each other. It only took like 30 minutes in the beginning of the day, and all of a sudden the energy in the room changed quite a bit. And here's a quick one. This is Rasmus on our team, who's the first designer at Spotify, and this was like, I think, a really early sketch of Spotify, believe it or not. Can't really tell. I think it was. And just in the interest of being vulnerable, this was like a really embarrassing thing that I made a long time ago. And I think maybe more embarrassing than like, what is this thing, like this tree and this like water thing, was the comments and my expression of what it was, where I was saying like, oh, like, I don't know, I don't care that it's simple, like this kind of angsty teen kind of, I don't know, feeling, and someone going, well, the problem is that trees can't grow out of the water, like, what are you trying to do? And I was like, well, that's the point. It doesn't need to be realistic. So I don't know. It was just kind of ridiculous. And one quick anecdote about that feeling of being vulnerable or sharing something, there was a study where people were put into 2 groups and asked to come up with creative ideas for what to do with a paperclip. The first group just jumped right in and started brainstorming, and the other group started with each sharing an embarrassing story. And the idea was that the group that came up, that had to kind of share this embarrassing story first, had more interesting ideas that came out of it. Because they felt safe, because they felt comfortable, and because the energy of the room was light. It wasn't critical. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit just in the interest of time. But the idea is that how can you have more fun so that people, and be more vulnerable, whatever it might take, to create an environment that is more healthy. So just to end, a couple of quick fun moments that we've done as a way to kind of stay inspired or as a team. This was one where we created SimCity, or like a fake city together. We took like 30 people in the office and kind of just like goofed around and like made some interesting stuff, which was super fun. People made like little Pokemon references or all kinds of things in there, and it was just like, it really like lightened the tone and environment of working together. We've done this with other teams as well. You know, you can make comic books, whatever. This was like when I moved from New York, kind of designing like a little bar crawl. And if you want to use any of these, or if you want to use this with your team and try it, we built this quick site for like on a hack day that we had, where you can just kind of find all these different templates, and you can just give it a shot with your team and see what happens. So to end, just kind of like a quick, it looks like some of you were taking pictures and I transitioned. I don't know if you still needed it, but I'll give you like a second because I'm running just a little bit over. Cool. I can always find you after if you're all going to the after party and stuff. So the last thing is, maybe a bit of a controversial opinion on critiques. How many of you do design critiques in your company in some way, or like some kind of like environment where you're giving feedback? So I feel like a lot of people I talk to when we meet with all these companies, they don't love them. Like they're just a little bit, sometimes a little tricky. And I think as a really cool goal, how do we make them actually fun? How do we make them interesting and safe? How do we make them inspiring and not just a place where you feel like your work is getting torn apart? And here's kind of a quick quote on that in the context of The Daily Show.
The first thing I notice is that the room is full of creative bursts. Believe it or not, there's a name for that in the psychology of creativity. It's called burstiness. Burstiness is like the best moments in improv jazz. Someone plays a note, someone else jumps in with a harmony, and pretty soon you have a collective sound that no one planned. Most groups never get to that point, but you know burstiness when you see it. At The Daily Show, the room just literally sounds like it's bursting with ideas.
I recommend checking out the podcast later. They actually air some of the like actual conversations in the room where they do it, and there's something really cool about it. So what we do at Figma in our design critiques to kind of inspire that is we have different working styles, and we announce in the beginning of the critique what kind of feedback someone wants and how we want to shape the energy of the room. For example, popcorn style is kind of like improv, where maybe you just kind of, it's okay to jump in and interrupt, and that's the expectation. I definitely wouldn't recommend doing that all the time, but for some kinds of work, it can be helpful. Instead, what you want to do to make sure that you can include everyone's perspective is go around the room one at a time and make sure that you hear everyone's opinion. So again, just to recap, here's this kind of philosophy for an open and healthy work environment. How do you involve others, remembering that you should lose your ego as a designer? How do you work in the open, and how do you give exposure to your work early on? How do you work in a variety of spaces and consider the Udo Mia Machine as maybe a framework to do that? How do you kind of use bisociation or mixing and matching or kind of like stealing and borrowing ideas left and right to get to better outcomes? And finally, how do you do it with less fear of failure? How do you do it where you can encourage kind of laughter in your critiques? Thanks.
Thank you.